just wanted to thank Barbara for her really interesting talk. Speaking of work intensification, this morning I was actually at the Choice Shonky Awards, stage managing that at 7 a.m, and now I'm here in Melbourne, so certainly putting that pressure on myself, but I think that's the experience of a lot of young people these days. We feel like we need to do these things in order to get ahead, almost feel like you have no choice. So I'm going to speak about internships today, specifically unpaid internships. And as Barbara's talked about some of the issues around shadow and unpaid work and about regulation and compliance. With internships, we're not even really there yet with the regulation, and then we've got to think about compliance. So we're almost sort of a step back from that. And thank you again for Victorian Fabians for inviting me to speak here tonight as well. So if you're sitting in the room and we just had this discussion and you're under 30, chances are you've done at least 1, 2 or maybe even 3 unpaid internships. As I'm going to tell you tonight, they're really hard to define, they're completely unregulated in Australia, and also their quality isn't guaranteed in any way. An unpaid internship can be a really good experience for both the intern and the organisation, and I'm going to tell you some of the ways that that is possible, but there are also really serious concerns with the rapid growth of unpaid internships in Australia, and some of that's around the issue of social inequality and access to internships. So first I'm going to talk about how we define internships, and then secondly I'll draw on some research that we've seen in the UK and the US, which outlines both benefits and negatives, and they've done quite thorough research in those 2 countries. And then I'll conclude with some further questions that regulators, advocates and researchers are asking, and questions that we need to answer in order to effectively regulate this segment of the market, to make sure that the experience for interns ultimately is one that's educational, if we are going to have unpaid internships at all, that it is purely an educational experience. Or maybe we consider banning it altogether. Check this is the right way. So, what is an internship? I've got a few photos. It might be somebody getting coffee. It might be a way to get experience. But ultimately, it's typically a chance for a young person to gain some practical experience in their field of study. So usually an intern stays with an organisation for some period of time. They'll participate in projects, meetings, they'll be in the workplace. And what we hear in the media often is that an intern's probably likely to do unproductive work. They're probably going to get the coffee, be treated a bit as a workhorse to do menial tasks. What's also interesting is now that young people and the media in general commonly believe that in order to get a job, you need to do an internship first. And this is certainly true for the profession. So you look at people coming out of social sciences degrees, law degrees, engineering degrees, you're expected to have done some kind of work placement or internship. So internships are just one part of a long history of work-based training programs. So they've gone from traditional apprenticeship programs right through to modern structured internship programs. And today the term intern or internship has been co-opted to encompass a broader range of work-based training programs. They're really ambiguous and broad in their meaning. So they're pretty loosely defined, and we've got no universal definition of these. And there's a lot of confusion about what an internship is and what sort of experience it should provide for the intern. So some of you might know this book. Ross Perlin, he authored a book called Intern Nation. He gives a pretty nice quote highlighting this ambiguity. So he describes internships as a kind of smokescreen, more brand than job description, lumping together an explosive and intermittent and precarious roles we might otherwise call volunteer, temp, summer job, and so on. So it's this ambiguity that's made it really difficult for regulators to police this form of unpaid work, and also for exploited unpaid interns to seek some sort of legal recourse. Andrew Stewart and Rosemary Owens authored the Fair Work Ombudsman's report on unpaid work, which was done a few years ago now, and they also say the same thing. So they say that internships in Australia have a broad and uncertain meaning, and that it allows this term to be applied to everything from paid entry-level jobs to voluntary work for charitable or community organisations. So we've got this ambiguity here, so it's wise probably for us to look at what the different approaches are in different countries. And I'm just going to quickly run through these different approaches in the US, the UK and Australia. Why am I doing this? A legal definition is important because it's going to guide any sort of regulatory approach or compliance, and it also helps organisations figure out what their obligations are. And often we see, and I see this definitely in my work at Choice, but you have an organisation, they're really going to go for the lowest common denominator. If the ACCC doesn't tell them that something's illegal, they'll go for it. And I think we see the same thing often with working arrangements. And a good regulatory approach with the best educational interests of the intern in mind should really guide organisations to run equitable and also legal programs. So we'll just quickly run through how are other countries defining internships. So I've got up here on the slide, this is the US example. They've placed the emphasis on the existence of an employment relationship, which is tested using a 6-point test, which is defined by the Department of Labour, and that's up there. And you can probably go and look it up if you want to give it a detailed read. And so employers and interns can apply this test to see if their unpaid internship is legal. However, it's not without its critics, and some legal academics in the US have criticised how robust it is. So in the United Kingdom, sort of the same but a little less robust. It's dependent on the duties performed by the intern. If the intern's doing the duties of a worker, then they're afforded the right to pay. Finally, the approach in Australia has relied on determining the status of the intern with a bit of a common law approach. So there's been several landmark cases, which I'm sure many of you have seen in the media, where unpaid interns have performed significant work in an unpaid internship. They've retrospectively then been afforded the right to payment for that work. However, there's always a bit of a tension with this because interns can actually face future career roadblocks if they take public action against their host organisation. So in the age of Google technology, often HR managers might Google the name of someone applying for a job and they'll see immediately that this person's taken action against a previous employer. And we know that from other examples as well, not just interns, but people who've taken public action against their employers. So government regulators and the courts are working towards firmer definitions as unpaid internship phenomenon grows, and we saw that before when we saw only sort of the younger people in the room have done them. It's something that's growing, it's not something that's always been here. And one common trait that researchers and regulatory bodies have acknowledged so far is that legitimate unpaid internships must have an absence of significant work, and we're certainly likely to see this in any future real definition of internships. And ultimately, this regulatory approach will mean clearer protection for people undertaking unpaid work, firmer guidance for organisations, and that should lead to a better overall experience. So now that we've just explored those definitions, I'm going to talk a bit about what makes a good or bad internship. And there's been a fair bit of research done on this. But it's really important to understand what makes a good internship because that will help us positively influence any regulatory definition that comes along. And it will also help organisations, especially the proactive organisations who do actually want to do the right thing and run good internships programs because they do see that as a way to attract the best talent. So whether internships are viewed as an educational experience or an employment relationship will influence this regulatory approach. And in the first instance, a best practice unpaid internship should function primarily as an educational experience for students and recent graduates, which assists them in boosting their employability and giving them tangible skills correlated to their chosen occupation without an expectation that they perform significant work. Given that our local research is limited, what can we learn from other countries? So I'm just going to talk through some of those now. So although we hear a lot of really bad stories in the media about unpaid internships, there are documented positive outcomes associated with well-structured internship programs. Structured programs focus on a learning in the workplace model. It's structured to prepare them for a particular career path. So they're not doing work that's not relevant to what they're studying. And it should offer them a way to gain practical experience with networking opportunities also built into that program. And These well-regarded internships also represent a kind of currency for the intern. So actually a study that was completed earlier this year, which is quite interesting, was a study of graduate resumes. So they dummied up hundreds of graduate resumes and sent them off to companies, some with internships, some without. And they saw that an internship on a resume actually increased your likelihood of progressing to an interview by 14%. So there is evidence that says that there is some kind of value on these internships. And we need to regulate that because people are trying to access these programs, and we need to make sure that employers understand the exact value of what they're getting when they hire someone with an internship on their resume. So understanding how work experience like unpaid internships can impact on an individual's employability is crucial to developing public and private policy. In many cases, there's an expectation that recent graduates or students should be employment ready simply by getting a degree. So you think that you're going to go get your science degree, that you'll be able to get a job straight out of university. However, there's a tension because businesses expect that businesses these days are expecting that young people already have existing work experience in addition to their studies. So somewhere along the line, someone has to pick up some work experience, and whether that's paid or unpaid is really where the debate is at the moment. And I'm sure that some of you here are aware of the vocal criticism in the media on unpaid internships. And this criticism centres largely on the exploitation of young people in unpaid internships. And it says that unpaid internships only seek to widen the gap between the rich and the poor. This is back to that inequality problem we were talking about before. So problems that result from unpaid internships actually certainly seem to focus on that broader societal impact. It looks at diversity, it looks at wealth, not the individual. So the benefits of completing an unpaid internship would largely really only be beneficial to the individual who gains some experience and a resume filler, and the host or the host organisation who has free labour and they've got potentially a fully inducted future employee that they don't have to train up. So David Yamada, who's a legal academic in the US, and he's a quite outspoken critic of unpaid internships, has said that unpaid internships only seek to widen this gap between rich and poor. And alongside him, other critics have argued that graduates and students from low socioeconomic backgrounds are really prevented from taking up these opportunities because they lack both economic and social capital to find suitable internships. They don't have those familial or social networks to find the opportunities, and then they don't have the economic capital to be able to support themselves through that opportunity. We haven't seen any studies specifically looking at this area in Australia yet, but it's easy to imagine how a student from a rural or regional background might have trouble coming to the city to do an internship without a family network to stay within the city, or some low cost or free accommodation, especially in, I think, Sydney and Melbourne, with very expensive cities. It's also easy to assume that many of these unpaid internships come about from informal arrangements formed between individuals and employers in position of power. So thinking of the partners, executives at large firms who might be able to get their friend's son or daughter an internship to help them out. So these are really only available to people who have that necessary social capital. So far, we don't really have the evidence, as I said, in Australia to confirm these reports. However, the assumptions are concerning, and it's something that researchers and the government should definitely be looking at. Research also shows that unpaid internships in their nature can yield poor experiences for the intern. So as far back as the 1980s, there was a study that warned universities that firms wishing to hire unpaid interns would likely provide the interns with a poor experience, and they said that those firms were just looking for someone to do their undesirable tasks. A 2004 study also warns of exploitative business practices, with businesses citing horror stories of previous interns who had been overworked and not compensated fairly. So this is not, it seems like a new phenomenon, but it's really not. So there's also a lot of discussion about how unpaid internships may cause a lack of diversity in organisations, and some argue employers play a role in reinforcing this equality by providing and promoting unpaid internships. Employers are actually beginning to acknowledge this, not in Australia, but you can see these examples up here in the US, although there is one Australian example down in the bottom corner. In September, so very recently, the state of New York announced that it would be paying all its interns in its largest cultural institutions to specifically increase the diversity of their workforce. So their study showed that 60% of the state's cultural institutions' executive bodies were white, which was not at all reflective of New York City's population and New York City's diversity. And you can see actually in the corner there, it's a bit small, but that is a photo of on the left, the Republican Washington DC summer intern cohort, and on the right is the Democrat one. And that was a big story in the media recently too, about how people were commenting that the Republican unpaid intern cohort didn't have a wide variety of people in there. So you can probably look at that photo larger at some point at home. And in Australia, in a recent article in the Financial Review, there was one of the executives lamented the lack of diversity in the Australian video game industry. He cited that the unpaid work that graduates and students complete to build their portfolios is the foundation of the industry's monocultural feel. So he's the chief executive of Big Ant Studies in Melbourne, and says that we'll be missing out on the rich opportunities for cultural diversity that a robust game development environment enables. So while all of the above, both the positives and the negative aspects of unpaid internships has been documented on some level in an American and British context, we're still lacking a lot of local context here in Australia. Most analysis so far has centred around the legal implications of taking on unpaid interns. And for anybody interested, I mentioned it before, but a very solid background of this is in Andrew Stewart and Rosemary Owen's Unpaid Work Arrangements, Exploitation or Experience report, which they wrote for the Fair Work Ombudsman. And researchers, government and regulators are still asking broader questions in this area, and many of them remain unanswered in both a local and global context. So some of those questions, what actually makes a good internship experience? And this is something I'm trying to uncover. Can internships that are unpaid still be equitable? Can they still be fair? Do unpaid internships actually improve career outcomes for young people? Do internships help develop career goals and plans? Do they actually help you get to where you want to go? So there's quite a few questions floating around there that we don't really know the answers to. So maybe some of you can help us answer them tonight. Firstly, I think just to sum up, we need to ensure that internships are educational experiences that really place an emphasis on a practical application of study in the workplace. Secondly, we need to make sure that the educational nature of internships is reflected in the regulation. We need a robust definition, and then we need enforcement, and we need to check on that compliance. And lastly, we need to ensure that opportunities for practical experience through internships and other programs are available to all, and that we actually encourage diversity. So of course there's a lot I haven't been able to mention this evening. It's a really large topic, including some of the great advocacy work here and abroad. So I can see Dimity from Interns Australia here, who are doing some really good work, and also some of the really interesting legal cases here and in the US. And also the merits of paid versus unpaid internships, and there's been a few studies on that, including one that says that paid internships will actually do you better in the long term. So that's it from me, but come and have a chat if you want to learn more or get in touch with me. Thank you.